It's pretty quiet. Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and this is one of US Armament's new reproduction DeLisle carbines. This is a gun that's been a pretty popular reproduction in very small, like individual gunsmiths here and there for a long time because it's a super cool gun. The short version, if you're not familiar with it, is this is an SMLE, short magazine Lee Enfield #1 Mark III, rebuilt in 45 ACP with a ginormous suppressor on it and rechambered to 45 ACP because that is a naturally subsonic cartridge, and when combined with this huge suppressor, makes for an incredibly quiet carbine. These were manufactured in the middle of World War II and used in very limited numbers by British commandos raiding into Europe. Now, there was actual production of these guns, approximately 130 of them. By the time they were actually in production, they're really, like, the use case had kind of dropped away because once the landings at Normandy took place, there was a lot less call for covert commando teams sneaking over onto the French coastline. However, they did go on to be used in places like Malaya, as well as who knows where else by British special operations groups. There's probably a few of these still in inventory somewhere today. Now, we're going to take a look at this. We're going to do some shooting with it, and we'll show you up close how it works. Let's start with just a couple of test shots. So this uses a slightly modified 1911 magazine. Go. It's pretty darn quiet. It is zeroed from US Armament at 50 yards, and I have a 50-yard silhouette there. And I have no problem at all hitting it. All right, let's go inside. Let's take a closer look at this, and then we'll come back out and do some more shooting with it. So the DeLisle carbine was developed by one William Godfrey DeLisle. He was born in 1905. He was an engineer, a mechanical and electrical engineer, joined the British Air Ministry in 1935, and had gotten into the hobby of making silencers for his friends at university, which did him well when a few years later, once World War II began, he started designing and experimenting with a suppressed rifle for British commando use. Now, this was originally one of a couple of different models that was proposed to the British military, one like this in 45 ACP, but also some examples, some rifles in 22 rimfire. Now, they ended up going with 45 ACP for the better lethality compared to a 22. And prototypes of this were made at the Ford Dagenham factory in 1943, and then eventually the Sterling Company got a contract to manufacture them in quantity. The original contract was actually for 500 of the guns, but it was canceled as the war, came close to an end because they just weren't necessary. So, as I said, approximately 130 of these were originally manufactured, plus one of them as an experiment for airborne use. Instead of a fixed wood stock, that one has an underfolding stock, basically a Sterling submachine gun stock. So I have videos on both the standard and airborne original DeLisles, and I'll link to those in the description if you'd like to have a little bit more background and get a closer look at one of the originals. As for the reproductions here, they've done a pretty good job. So the original DeLisle is based on, as I said, a #1 Mark III. So I have a regular #1 Mark III here that I can use as a comparison. And the first thing you'll notice is that the bolt has been shortened and the barrel extended back. So the original guns have a 7-inch long 45 ACP barrel. They're actually built from Thompson gun barrels. And they do, in fact, extend back to here. So the chamber is right there instead of being up here on the original Enfields. The bolt is shortened. The stripper clip bridge, the charger bridge, has been removed. So you will see that effectively, like accurately done here. One of the cool things about making a reproduction DeLisle is you can literally just take an SMLE and start pulling parts off of it. And that's how they did the originals. So that is appropriate. The trigger guard and magazine have been replaced. They made a fixed magazine well that holds a 1911 magazine. Now, it's not exactly a 1911 magazine, and this is because this is how the British originally did it. They started with a 1911 magazine and then added this rib on the back so that your magazine release is this little lever already in the trigger guard. That is conveniently also the release for the SMLE's magazine, right there. So they just repurposed that. The safety still works just fine because the trigger mechanism is left unchanged. So again, for comparison, SMLE bolt, DeLisle bolt. A couple other things to note. The DeLisle bolt head has this big notch cut out of it. That is for the ejector. The extractor has also been slightly reshaped to work more properly with 45 ACP. And this is the ejector on the outside right there. So you can see this is the ejector screwed onto the outside of the receiver. If we look inside, that's the ejector. So in normal operation, you can see that cutout slips around the ejector, and then as I push the bolt the rest of the way forward, the ejector is pushed out of the receiver until I have the bolt locked in place. Then when you are extracting an empty case, the extractor is going to hold it on the bolt face. It's going to come back until right there when that ejector will kick it out of the gun. And I should point out that the originals of these had pretty wimpy, pretty sketchy feeding and extraction. This just isn't an action that was ideal for 45 ACP. It's what they had, so they used it, and the guns worked, but not nearly to the level of flawless, smooth reliability that we would expect today. So US Armaments has started with an Indian SMLE, so it's a #1 Mark III star, which is correct, made by So US Armament has built these on Ishapur Enfields. They are correct, #1 Mark III SMLEs, manufactured at Ishapur. This is a 1969 manufactured gun. And we then have US Armaments markings added on there, and a serial number up here on the receiver. So they've actually used the original serial number, but they've re-stamped it, I think, just to make sure that they're within ATF depth guidelines. Now, on the original guns, the suppressor tube was removable. There are actually 2 bolts at the front, which are properly recreated here. And then we also have a pair of markings here on the bottom of the suppressor. Now, as originally made, the DeLisle Carbine's suppressor tube was removable, which, like, obviously that's how you would make it. US Armament has chosen to go a slightly different route here, and they've made the body of the magazine, of the suppressor, permanently affixed. That way they can have the original 7-inch Thompson barrel, a 7-inch 45 caliber barrel in here, but it's still just a 1-stamp gun. I guess that means a little bit less now that the transfer tax is 0, but it's still a 1-stamp gun because the suppressor tube is 16 inches long and is attached permanently to the receiver. It's not a short-barreled rifle, it is just a suppressor. So this is kind of like the idea of a pinned and welded flash hider on a 14.5-inch AR, just taken to excess. It's a 9-inch pin and weld essentially on a 7-inch barrel. The sights here are a reproduction of the proper original DeLisle sights. DeLisle's did not use Lee Enfield sights. They actually use sights off of Lanchester submachine guns, and this is a recreation of that. So it's set for 50 yards there with settings out to 100, 150, and 200. And we have little detents there so you can actually set that properly. And the front sight has adjustability to it in the form of the 2 mounting screws there. So the whole thing can be rotated to line it up, and then it can also be pivoted left or right. That's your windage adjustment. There is no elevation adjustment other than replacing the front sight blade with a taller one. The front handguard here is a reproduction of what was originally done. They did not use Lee Enfield front furniture because they have this like 2-inch in diameter suppressor tube and Enfield furniture won't fit. So they made a wooden handguard like that and actually just used a little sheet metal strip like the one you see here, nailed into the rear end of the stock, sort of to bridge the gap between these 2 pieces. We have the 2 bolts safety wired on the front of the suppressor body. That is how the original was done. Of course, on the original, taking out these bolts allowed you to remove the entire suppressor body. On this, it just allows you to remove the front cap, which is keyed in place there, and then I believe the baffles, but not the main body of the tube, so that it doesn't have to be registered as a short-barreled rifle. So that is the DeLisle. This is a pretty darn well done reproduction covering all of the major elements of the original DeLisle carbines. So let's get this back out to the range and do a bit more shooting. The one thing that I wish they had done more historically accurate is the suppressor tube itself. This and all of the suppressor internals here are made of steel. That's great for longevity, but you're not going to be putting a large volume of fire through a bolt action 45 ACP carbine, and using an aluminum suppressor assembly allowed the British to make this gun 1.5 pounds lighter than this reproduction. So the originals were about 8.25 pounds. This comes in at just over 9.75 pounds, and all of that additional extra weight is up here in the front, and unfortunately it really impacts the handling and balance of the rifles. I have had the chance to handle some original DeLisles, and they are really nice, slick, handy little carbines. This one is less so because of all this extra weight up front. Anyway, let's get it back out to the range and do a bit more shooting and see how it does handle. All right, and just so you guys can get a feel for what it sounds like without the smack on the steel, because so far I have not missed that steel once. It is a big target, but we'll take a shot up into the hillside in the back. And a little tiny thwap when it hits the ground out there. So, kind of sounds like a cap gun. This certainly seems to me to be completely hearing safe. I don't know that I would want to be without ear protection for thousands of rounds of this in a day, but subsonic, huge can there. I don't have the equipment to actually test decibel levels, but this thing is as quiet as something gets, short of being a 22. And frankly, it's probably quieter than a lot of suppressed 22 pistols. All right, just in the relatively small number of rounds that we've done, I've actually been rather impressed by the cycling. 45 ACP in an Enfield, well, 45 ACP in any bolt action is a very short throw of the bolt. It's a very stubby cartridge. It has to do a lot of like up, in. The very first few rounds I fired of this, which were off camera, were a little stickier, a little trickier to cycle, had to jiggle the bolt a bit. But just by the second magazine, that seems to have kind of worn itself out and gone away. This is never going to be the super smooth cycling, you know, mad minute style of fire it with your middle finger kind of thing that a 303 can be, just because of the geometry of the 45 ACP cartridge. And frankly, original DeLisle carbines have a well-earned reputation for pretty pathetic ejection, which you'll see on this. It kind of flops cases out, but that's how this gun originally worked, and I wouldn't expect a reproduction to really be able to make that any different. Yeah, there we go. So that's, there we go. There we go, there's a nice center hit. Now, I want to try something out. This rear sight is allegedly calibrated out to 150, or out to 200 yards. We're going to take this back to 100 and see if this is actually on at 100 yards. Let's go try it. That appears to be pretty close to on. Little high. There we go. All right, so I'm a little bit torn on this. There are definitely some pros and there are definitely some cons. For the pros, it's a retail available gun. US Armament is making these in at least a small quantity. You can just order one if you want it, which has been always kind of been a problem with DeLisle's. They've usually been made by small gunsmith shops who do them on custom order, or they make a couple of them. Valkyrie Arms did them 25 years ago. Finding those today is pretty hard. However, some of those, well, pretty much all of those guns are also, to my mind, a little bit higher quality than these are. Because they're made in very small batches or individual, they're usually built on actual British SMLEs as opposed to Ishapore receivers like this. The better ones will actually use Lanchester rear sights instead of making repros. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. And then my biggest complaint about the US Armament guns is the weight and the balance. So the original DeLisle's weighed in at 8¼ pounds, and the baffles and the suppressor tube were made out of aluminum. Because why wouldn't you? It's lightweight, and you don't need, the downside of aluminum on a suppressor is it doesn't have a lot of sustained fire capability. But you know what? This is a 7-round, 8-round, depending on magazine, bolt action 45. You are not mag dumping, you're not doing mag dump burn down tests on a DeLisle carbine. So an aluminum suppressor works just fine. However, US Armament went ahead and made the whole suppressor assembly out of steel. As a result, this gun is just a little over 9¾ pounds. It's 1.5 pounds heavier than the originals, with all of that weight out here. It's like taking a regular DeLisle and duct taping a brick to the front of it. And this is just not nearly as handy of a gun to hold up, nearly as handy of a gun to carry around. The balance is like way out here. It's just, it sounds like a small thing on paper, but I feel like because of the weight distribution, it really makes a difference. It's a lot less fun to carry this around all day, or even for a short range trip, than an original would be. And then of course, the other downside to these guns is the price tag. I checked before filming, they are $7,000, which to my mind is ridiculously high. That's about, well, if I went looking for older, previously made DeLisle's, and I found them between right about that point. Like the highest results at public auctions would bring $7,000, $7,500, but there were plenty of guns selling for half that much as well. And I think, given the design choices on here, the use of Ishapore receivers, I think the price on this ought to be quite a lot lower. So for what it's worth, US Armament sent me this gun to test. I have a little bit of a back history here. I bought the very first one of these that they produced with my own money. Got it, had some problems with it. I was going to return it. I ended up selling it to a friend who really wanted it. So I got my money back out of it. And I mentioned my concerns to US Armament. They went ahead and made some improvements and sent me this one as a loaner to film with the option of buying it for $6,000, $1,000 off retail if I wanted to keep it. I am not going to be keeping it. So that's my decision on this. It is a very cool gun. If you want a fully functional DeLisle, like, here's your chance without having to go watch auctions for 6 months or a year and fight other people. You can just order one of these, but you are going to pay for the privilege. And I just really wish they'd done the front end out of aluminum. So there you go. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I do appreciate US Armament being willing to send me a second one of these to do some video on. So this will be going back to them, and maybe one of you guys will end up with it. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.